The wind howled against the cabin, rattling the windows as snow piled high outside. The storm had swallowed everything in sight, leaving nothing but a white abyss beyond the doorstep. Then, a faint scratching at the door. Daniel Carter sat motionless, ears straining. At first he dismissed it as the wind, branches scraping against the wood, but the sound came again. Slow, desperate. A weak whimper followed. His pulse quickened. No one should be out in this weather. Rising from his chair, he approached the door, hesitating for just a moment before unlocking it. The moment he pulled it open, icy wind rushed inside, biting through his skin. But it was not the cold that stole his breath. A small figure lay curled on the snow-covered doorstep. A puppy. Shivering, weak, eyes pleading for help. Daniel's chest tightened. Something about this was not right. Daniel Carter preferred the silence. His cabin, nestled deep in the woods, sat miles away from the nearest town. The only sounds that usually filled the air were the rustling of trees and the distant calls of wildlife. It was peaceful, predictable, and exactly the life he had chosen. He had once lived among the chaos of the city, where car horns, voices, and endless movement never ceased. That world had drained him, piece by piece, until he had nothing left to give. Solitude had been his escape. Each day followed a simple rhythm. Mornings started with coffee on the porch, afternoons were spent chopping firewood or fixing small repairs, and evenings were reserved for quiet moments by the fireplace. He did not expect visitors, he did not need company. But tonight something was different. The wind carried a strange weight, as if whispering a warning. The fire crackled softer, the usual comfort of its warmth failing to settle his mind. Then the sound came. A soft, rhythmic scratching at the door. At first he dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, but the noise persisted. It was deliberate. Daniel set his mug down, his movements slow but alert. His body tensed, instincts on edge. There should be no one out there. A whimper followed, faint but undeniable. His stomach twisted. For the first time in a long while, uncertainty crept into his carefully built world. And then, just like that, his quiet, structured life shattered. The scratching at the door grew more urgent. Daniel's pulse quickened as he reached for the handle. The storm outside was merciless, the wind howling like a living force. What kind of creature would be out in this? A final, desperate whimper cut through the air. He unlatched the door and pulled it open. A blast of icy wind rushed inside, momentarily stealing his breath. Snow swirled in chaotic spirals, and for a second he saw nothing but white. Then his eyes landed on it. A small, trembling shape lay curled on the doorstep, half buried in the snow. A puppy. Soaked, shivering, barely clinging to consciousness. Daniel's breath caught. No collar, no leash, no signs of an owner anywhere. The puppy's wide, pleading eyes locked onto his. It was more than fear in those eyes. It was something else, something Daniel could not yet name. The scratching at the door grew more frantic. Daniel hesitated, hand hovering over the handle. A sense of unease settled deep in his chest. There was no reason for anyone, or anything, to be out in this storm. Then came the whimper. Faint, weak, desperate. Something in that sound unsettled him more than the storm itself. He took a steadying breath and unlatched the door. The cold hit him instantly. A biting wind rushed inside, carrying flurries of snow that stung his skin. The storm howled around him, making it difficult to see. But then, movement. A small shape huddled on the doorstep, curled into itself, half buried in the snow. A puppy. Daniel's breath caught. It was trembling violently, tiny ribs rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. Snow clung to its soaked fur, its paws tucked tightly beneath its body in a last attempt to hold on to warmth. No collar, no leash, no footprints leading to where it had come from. Daniel crouched down, reaching out slowly. The puppy lifted its head, barely able to keep its eyes open. But when it met his gaze, something flickered there. Not just fear, something deeper. Something that made Daniel's gut twist with a feeling he could not explain. This was no ordinary lost dog. Daniel carried the puppy inside, wrapping it in the thickest blanket he could find. Its body was still trembling, but its breathing slowed as warmth began to seep in. But something felt off. Its fur, though damp, was too clean for a stray. There were no signs of malnutrition, no rough patches that hinted at weeks of survival on its own. It was exhausted, but not starving. As Daniel gently ran his fingers through its fur, he noticed something even stranger, a marking near its ear. At first he thought it was dirt or an old scar, but as he brushed away the damp strands of fur, a small, deliberate symbol was revealed beneath. Not a birthmark, not an injury, a marking. Daniel's stomach tightened. Someone had put this here. This was not just a lost pet, and somehow, in the middle of a blizzard, it had ended up on his doorstep. The road leading to Cascade Trail was nearly unrecognizable beneath the thick layers of ice and snow. Daniel's truck rumbled along the deserted path, tires crunching over the frozen terrain. The puppy sat in the passenger seat, unusually still. Its ears were perked, its gaze locked out the window, as if it knew exactly where they were going. Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel. "This place means something to you, doesn't it?" he muttered. The dog gave no response, but its small body tensed. Daniel exhaled slowly, watching the dense trees blur past. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the endless white landscape. He had hiked this trail before, back when he first moved out here, but today it felt different. Too quiet, too still. The wind had died down, and yet the usual sounds of the woods, chirping birds, rustling branches, were completely absent. Daniel did not like it. He adjusted his scarf and drove deeper into the trail. As he reached the first clearing, he slowed the truck to a stop. The entrance to Cascade Trail was still marked by an old wooden sign, half buried in the snow. The path beyond it wound through the forest, disappearing into the trees. Daniel climbed out, slinging his backpack over his shoulders. The moment his boots hit the snow, the puppy whined. He turned. The dog remained in the truck, its body rigid, eyes fixed on the tree line ahead. Daniel frowned. "Come on, let's go." The puppy refused to move. Daniel hesitated. He could see it, the fear in its eyes. He crouched beside it. "I know this place scares you," he said softly, "but we need to see why." The puppy let out a small huff, its tail twitching slightly. Then, slowly, it hopped onto the snow. Together, they stepped onto the trail. The further they walked, the stronger the unease became. Snow coated the ground in an untouched white blanket. No footprints, no broken branches, as if nothing had disturbed this place in weeks. But Daniel knew better. Something had happened here, and whatever it was, the puppy remembered it. The first sign of trouble came about half a mile in. Daniel stopped mid-step, eyes narrowing at the ground. A set of deep scratches gouged into the bark of a nearby tree. Too large for an animal, too deliberate to be an accident. His stomach twisted. The puppy's ears flattened, its tiny body pressing closer to his leg. Daniel reached out, running his fingers over the bark. The scratches were fresh, not more than a few days old. His gaze swept the area, searching for more clues. And then, he saw it. About 10 feet ahead, half buried in the snow, was something dark. Daniel's pulse quickened as he approached. A tent, or what was left of one. The fabric was torn, the poles collapsed. A frayed rope lay nearby, stiff with ice. He crouched down, brushing the snow away. Underneath, he found an empty leash. His breath hitched. This was it. This was where the missing dog had been taken from. The puppy let out a small whimper, stepping closer. Its tiny nose twitched as it sniffed the air. Daniel swallowed hard. This was not just a case of a lost pet. Something had taken this dog. And now Daniel was standing in the place where it had happened. The silence of the forest grew heavier. Daniel felt it before he saw it, the undeniable sensation of being watched. He turned sharply, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just endless white, the bare trees stretching toward the sky. But still, something was wrong. The wind picked up slightly, carrying a strange, faint scent. Smoke? Daniel's heart pounded. Someone had been here recently. And that meant someone could still be here. The puppy pressed against his leg, its small body quivering. Daniel tightened his grip on his backpack strap. He was not alone. For a moment, every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to get in his truck, drive home, and pretend none of this had happened. But then, he looked at the puppy. It was not just scared. It was waiting. Daniel exhaled slowly. This dog had not just survived. It had escaped. And now it had led him here. He pulled the map from his backpack, unfolding it with cold fingers. Cascade Trail stretched for miles, weaving deep into the forest. The missing dog post had said the family was camping near the lower ridge. That was another mile ahead. Daniel made his decision. He was going to find out what happened. With one last glance toward the trees, he adjusted his bag and pressed forward. The puppy followed. Together, they walked deeper into the woods, toward the truth waiting ahead. Daniel's hands tightened around the steering wheel as he drove toward Cascade Trail, the truck's tires crunching against the frozen road. The puppy sat beside him, unusually quiet. Not asleep, not relaxed, just watching. It had been restless the entire drive. At every turn, every bump in the road, its ears would twitch, its eyes scanning the surroundings like it was expecting something. Or someone. Daniel exhaled sharply. He had been tense ever since he found the abandoned tent at the base of the trail. The fresh scratches on the trees, the footprints outside his cabin that led nowhere, all of it pointed to something being very wrong. He glanced at the puppy. "You remember this place, don't you?" A small whimper. Daniel didn't need an answer. It knew. The deeper they drove into the forest, the more the unease grew. Snow draped over the trees in thick, untouched layers. The branches hung low, burdened by the weight of winter. The world around them looked pristine, untouched, but it was a lie. Daniel knew what the silence meant. Something was here, and it was watching. By the time Daniel reached the first clearing, he was gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He killed the engine, listening. Nothing. He had expected birds, distant rustling, anything but this dead, suffocating silence. The puppy whimpered again, shifting uncomfortably. Daniel exhaled and reached for his backpack. "Come on," he muttered, stepping out of the truck. The puppy hesitated at first, glancing toward the tree line, but after a moment it jumped down into the snow beside him. Daniel scanned the area. To his right, the narrow trail leading into Cascade Woods stretched into the distance, swallowed by the shadows of bare trees. To his left, the forest thickened, the density of the trees making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The puppy trotted forward a few steps, then froze. Its ears twitched. Then, a low growl. Daniel's stomach twisted. He followed its gaze. At first he saw nothing but untouched snow. But then, he saw them. Marks on the trees. Deep, deliberate scratches carved into the bark. Daniel swallowed hard. Not natural, not animal-made. They looked intentional. A message. The puppy let out another soft whine, pressing itself closer to his leg. Daniel inhaled sharply and stepped closer, brushing his gloved fingers over the markings. Fresh. Something had been here recently. His pulse quickened. He glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of the weight of the silence pressing in on them. Then, a few feet ahead, Something dark jutted out from the snow. Daniel narrowed his eyes. A tent, half collapsed, torn at the seams. Daniel moved cautiously toward it, scanning the surrounding area for any signs of movement. The fabric was stiff with frost, barely clinging to its frame. It had been here a while. He crouched down, brushing snow away from the entrance. Inside, nothing but scattered belongings. An empty sleeping bag, a rusted lantern, a discarded tin of food, long frozen over. But then, he saw it. A leash buried beneath the snow. Daniel's breath caught. The same frayed leash mentioned in the missing dog post. This was the place. This was where the puppy had been taken from. His fingers curled into fists. This had not been an accident. Something had taken it, and left no trace behind. And now, that same something had followed the dog back to him. Daniel stood abruptly, his heart pounding in his ears. He scanned the surrounding trees again. Still nothing, but the feeling had not gone away. He was not alone. A sudden movement. Daniel barely had time to register it before the puppy bolted. Hey, wait. The dog was gone in an instant, disappearing into the trees. Daniel took off after it. His boots skidded over the ice, breath coming in sharp bursts as he pushed forward, dodging low branches and uneven terrain. The dog was fast, weaving effortlessly through the snow, but Daniel couldn't lose it. Then, a clearing. Daniel stumbled to a stop. His breath hitched. Something stood ahead of him. A structure. At first, he thought it was a shed, buried beneath layers of snow and ice, but as he stepped closer, his stomach clenched. It was a shelter, and it was not abandoned. The door hung slightly open, its frame reinforced with thick wooden beams. Daniel moved forward carefully, every nerve in his body screaming at him to turn back. He reached the entrance, stepping just inside. The air was thick with dampness, the smell of old wood and something else, something metallic. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw them. Cages, rows of them, some empty, some still holding dogs inside. Daniel's breath came out in a shuddering exhale. His gaze landed on the markings, branded into the wooden beams, scrawled along the cage doors. And then his stomach dropped. The same mark on the puppy's ear. His pulse thundered. This dog had not been lost. It had been taken, and it had escaped from here. Daniel swallowed hard, stepping deeper into the room. The cages rattled as some of the dogs shifted at his presence. They were scared, hungry, waiting. He clenched his fists. Someone had been running a dog trafficking ring out here in the middle of nowhere, and the puppy had led him straight to it. His breath came faster. He had to get these dogs out. He had to. Then, a sound behind him. A sharp snap of a branch. Daniel's entire body went rigid. He was not alone. He turned slowly, just as a figure stepped out from the shadows of the trees. Tall, broad-shouldered, a heavy coat wrapped around them, hood pulled low over their face. Daniel's stomach twisted. The man stood completely still, only a few yards away. Then, after a moment, he exhaled. "So," the man muttered, "it found its way back." Daniel's heart pounded. The man ignored him, his gaze fixed on the puppy now pressed against Daniel's leg. "You should not be here," the man said. His voice was low, even, too calm. Daniel's fists clenched. "Neither should you." The man took a slow step forward. "I am going to tell you this once," he murmured. "Walk away. Forget what you saw." Daniel's breath came fast. He glanced toward the forest. He had to make a choice: run or fight. Daniel's breath came sharp and fast, his fingers twitching at his sides. The man stood just yards away, his heavy coat blending into the shadows of the forest. The hood obscured most of his face, but Daniel could feel his gaze, cold, measured. The puppy pressed closer to Daniel's leg, letting out a low growl. The man exhaled, slow and deliberate. "So," he muttered, his voice like gravel. "It found its way back." Daniel's gut twisted. This was not just some random criminal. This man knew the dog. He had been looking for it. He had been tracking it. "You should not be here," the man said again, his tone as even as before. "This is none of your concern." Daniel's fists clenched. "Yeah." He took a step forward. "Because it looks like a whole lot of stolen dogs locked in cages to me." The man sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. "You do not understand what you are stepping into," he said. "Walk away. Forget this." Daniel's eyes flicked to the shelter behind him. The dogs inside, some whimpering, some silent, too weak to make a sound. His jaw tightened. "I am not walking away," he said. For the first time, the man shifted. His stance straightened, the air around him growing heavier. A slow click. Daniel's stomach dropped. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a gun. Daniel took a slow step backward, pulse skyrocketing. "Do not make this difficult," the man said, raising the weapon slightly. "You should not have come here." The puppy let out a sharp bark, baring its tiny teeth. Daniel's mind raced. He was outmatched, unarmed, and alone. His truck was too far to make a run for it. His only option was to stall. He raised his hands slightly, not in surrender, but to buy time. "So what?" he asked. "You're just going to shoot me in the middle of the woods? That is a hell of a risk." The man was silent. Daniel could tell. He was thinking. The gun wavered, just slightly. Then, another sound. A sharp snap of a branch behind the man. He tensed. Daniel's pulse spiked. Was it an animal or Dash? Another figure stepped out of the trees. Daniel swallowed hard. A second man. Dressed the same way, heavy coat, obscured face, but his posture was different. Tense, urgent. He moved toward the first man, voice low and hurried. "We have a problem," he muttered. "The signal's out." The first man's jaw clenched. "What do you mean?" "I mean someone cut the connection. The feed is dead. They know we are here." Daniel's stomach twisted. They. Who the hell was they? The first man swore under his breath, then flicked his gaze back to Daniel. "You just had to come looking, didn't you?" he muttered. Daniel did not answer. His mind was spinning. Hard. The second man took a step closer. "What do we do with him?" The first man was silent for a long moment. Then he lowered the gun. But not in surrender. A decision had been made. And whatever it was, Daniel was not going to like it. Daniel did not wait. The second the gun was lowered, he moved. His boots dug into the snow, launching himself sideways, grabbing the first thing his fingers found, a broken branch half buried in the ground. The men reacted instantly. The first one swung the gun back up, but Daniel was already too close. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, slamming them both against a tree. The gun went off. A deafening crack echoed through the woods. Daniel felt the heat of the bullet rush past his ear. The second man lunged forward, but the puppy suddenly darted between them, snapping at his leg. He stumbled, swearing. Daniel took the opening. He swung the branch, striking the first man's arm. The gun dropped into the snow. No time to think. Daniel grabbed the weapon, turned it. The first man's eyes went wide. Daniel's breath came in short bursts, gun now pointed directly at them. For a long, frozen moment, no one moved. The second man held his hands up slightly, assessing the situation. The first man, the leader, just watched Daniel carefully. Then he smirked. "You have no idea what you just stepped into," he murmured. Daniel's hands did not waver. "Maybe not," he said, "but I am about to make damn sure the cops do." The smirk vanished. For the first time, the man looked angry. Then, in one sudden motion, he turned and ran. The second man hesitated, then took off after him. Daniel did not fire. He wanted to, but he had more important things to do. Daniel turned sharply toward the shelter. The dogs inside were stirring, sensing the shift. He rushed forward, yanking open the first cage. The dog inside, a thin retriever, stumbled out, legs shaking. Daniel grabbed the second cage, then the third. The puppy barked frantically beside him, running back and forth as if urging him to hurry. Daniel's hands were shaking as he pulled open the final cage. The moment the last dog was free, he turned to the puppy. "Come on." The puppy spun and bolted. Daniel followed, leading the pack of dogs out into the open. He ran. Branches slashed at his arms, his breath a ragged mess. His boots slipped over ice, but he did not stop. He could not stop. Not until he saw the truck. Not until they were out of here. And then, gunfire. A shot rang out behind them. Daniel ducked instinctively. They were trying to stop him, but it was too late. The truck was just ahead. Daniel threw open the door, the dogs scrambling in behind him. He jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. Another gunshot. The back window shattered. Daniel floored the gas. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning over the ice before finally catching traction. The last thing Daniel saw in the mirror. The two men standing at the tree line, watching as he escaped. Their faces unreadable. Daniel drove straight to town, straight to the police. The moment he pulled up, officers surrounded the truck, stunned at the sight of the trafficked dogs in the back. It took hours, giving his statement, describing the men, leading officers back to the site. But when they got there, it was empty. The shelter was gone. Every cage, every marking, wiped clean, like it had never been there. Daniel felt the weight settle in his chest. They had covered their tracks. They had planned for this. And worse, they were still out there. That night, Daniel sat in his cabin, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The puppy lay beside him, curled up in a tight ball. It was safe now, but he knew this was not over. The men were still out there, and they knew who he was. Daniel exhaled, running a hand down his face. This was supposed to be a quiet life, but now he had made enemies. And somehow he knew this was only the beginning. Daniel's breath burned in his lungs as he sprinted toward the truck, the snow crunching loudly beneath his boots. The dogs, frantic, terrified, raced alongside him, their paws slipping on the ice. Behind him, a gunshot shattered the silence. The bullet whizzed past his shoulder, slamming into a nearby tree with a dull thud. Too close. Daniel ducked instinctively, his grip tightening on the puppy as he powered through the snow. Another shot. This one struck the ground, kicking up ice and debris. His truck was only a few yards away. He reached it just as another gunshot rang out. Daniel yanked the door open, shoving the puppy inside before scrambling into the driver's seat. His hands trembled as he jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine sputtered. Not now, not now. Another shot, this one shattered the back window. Daniel slammed his fist against the steering wheel. The engine roared to life. He threw the truck into gear, his tires spinning wildly on the ice before finally catching traction. The moment they did, he pressed the gas to the floor. The truck lurched forward, the last thing he saw in the rearview mirror. The two men standing at the edge of the forest watching. They did not chase him. They did not fire another shot. They just watched, as if they already knew. This was not over. Daniel did not stop driving until he reached the police station. He pulled up to the curb, throwing the truck into park before stepping out, breathless and shaking. The officers inside barely had time to react before Daniel was rushing through the doors, demanding to speak to someone. They listened. He told them everything. The shelter, the cages, the men, the gunshots. He led them back to Cascade Trail. But when the police arrived at the site, the shelter was gone. The cages, the symbols, the markings on the trees, all of it, erased, as if it had never been there. But Daniel knew what he saw, and the police found enough. Footprints, burned-out campfires, small traces of something much bigger, enough to launch an investigation, enough to expose a dog trafficking ring, and all because one puppy escaped. One tiny, trembling creature that had found its way to Daniel's door. That puppy led them to something no one was supposed to see, and now the men behind it were running. Days passed. The storm faded, the snow settling into thick drifts across the landscape. The world was silent again. But Daniel was not the same. He sat in his chair near the fireplace watching the small golden puppy curled up on the blanket beside him. For the first time since that night it looked at peace. No more shaking, no more fear. It was safe. And for the first time in years, so was Daniel. He never planned on keeping a pet. He never wanted one. But now, he could not imagine life without it. The house no longer felt empty. The storm had passed, but the past had left its mark. Daniel would never look at a knock on the door the same way again. Daniel never expected a single knock on his door to change everything. What started as a freezing puppy seeking shelter led to a shocking discovery, a dangerous confrontation, and a truth that was never meant to be uncovered. But sometimes fate has a way of leading us exactly where we need to be. The puppy was not just lost. It was running from something bigger. And by following its silent plea for help, Daniel stumbled upon a hidden darkness buried deep in the snow. He may have escaped that night, but the men behind it, they are still out there. And now they know who he is. The story does not end here. What do you think happened next? Should Daniel go after them? Or has he already gotten too close to something dangerous? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories just like this one. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Because sometimes the most unexpected moments lead to the biggest truths. Would you have opened the door that night? Let us know below.